Big Shaq walked into the bustling restaurant, his imposing frame hidden under a simple hoodie and cap. The air smelled of sizzling food and stress. He surveyed the place, observing the chaos, servers rushing, cooks shouting, and customers impatiently waving for attention. It was clear the restaurant needed help, which was exactly why he was here. Shaq had recently acquired the establishment, though he hadn't announced it yet. Today, he was just another diner. Sliding into a corner booth, he noticed a young couple at the next table whispering complaints about their undercooked steak. Across the room, an elderly man tried in vain to get his waiter's attention. Shaq leaned back and sighed. He had hoped his investment was thriving, but it was clear this place was crumbling under poor management and strained staff. A waiter emerged from the kitchen, balancing a tray with barely concealed frustration. The name tag read, Tim, and his forced smile did little to mask the storm brewing underneath. Tim approached Shaq's table briskly. "What'll it be?" he asked, his tone sharp enough to cut through the din. Shaq glanced at the menu. "I'll take the special, please. And a water." Tim scribbled on his notepad with exaggerated annoyance. "Right. One special. Water. Anything else, Your Highness?" Shaq raised an eyebrow but said nothing. He could tell Tim was having a bad day, but the sarcasm was uncalled for. As Tim stomped off, Shaq decided to let it slide. For now. Nearby, a commotion broke out. A middle-aged woman was complaining loudly about her order being wrong. Tim rushed over, his irritation barely contained. "Ma'am, I already told you, the kitchen is backed up. If you want it fixed, you'll have to wait." The woman bristled. "Backed up? I've been waiting for 40 minutes. This is unacceptable." Tim sighed, muttering under his breath. "Unacceptable is working here." Shaq caught the remark. His curiosity deepened. Was Tim just a bad apple, or was there more to this story? When Tim returned with Shaq's plate, he slammed it down with a little too much force. "Here. Enjoy." Shaq examined the dish, undercooked chicken and a side of lukewarm vegetables. He looked up at Tim, who was already halfway to the kitchen, shaking his head. Before Shaq could say anything, another customer called out, "Excuse me. My drink hasn't arrived yet." Tim spun around, exasperated. "I'm not a magician, all right? Drinks take time." The customer's eyes widened in disbelief. "Excuse me?" Shaq decided it was time to intervene. He stood up, his towering presence immediately drawing attention. "Hey, Tim," he said, his voice calm but commanding. Tim turned, his irritation morphing into confusion at the sight of Shaq's impressive stature. "What? You're working hard, man. But snapping at customers? Not cool. They're not the problem." Tim blinked, taken aback. "Oh, great. Another customer here to tell me how to do my job. Thanks for the advice, big guy." Shaq chuckled softly, holding back. "All right. Just thought I'd say something. Carry on." As Shaq sat back down, Tim muttered, "Clueless customers," loud enough for Shaq to hear. Despite the insult, Shaq wasn't angry. He saw something in Tim, a mix of frustration and determination buried under the sarcasm. He decided then and there to dig deeper, to understand the root of Tim's attitude. Minutes later, Tim reappeared, still frazzled. "Anything else?" he asked curtly. Shaq smiled. "Yeah, actually. Can you tell me why you're so mad at the world today?" Tim froze, startled by the direct question. "What?" "You heard me. What's got you like this? Customers? Kitchen? Or something else?" Tim hesitated, his defensiveness faltering. "Look, man, you wouldn't understand. This job, it's not exactly the dream, all right?" Shaq nodded slowly. "Fair. But you ever think maybe the attitude's making it worse?" Tim stared at him, unsure how to respond. For a moment, the noise of the restaurant faded into the background. "I don't have time for this," Tim muttered, retreating to the kitchen. Shaq watched him go, feeling a mix of amusement and determination. Tim was rough around the edges, but he wasn't hopeless. He just needed the right push. As Shaq finished his meal, he made a mental note. Tim would be the first to know when the truth came out. For now, though, Shaq had seen enough. It was time to take action. The kitchen was a battlefield of clanging pots and sizzling pans, the air thick with tension and the smell of burnt food. Tim stormed through the chaos, barking orders at the cooks while juggling plates. His face was flushed, beads of sweat forming on his brow. He barely noticed Shaq observing from his corner table, his towering frame blending into the background. "Where's Table 7's order?" Tim shouted, slamming a tray onto the counter. A cook gestured helplessly toward a pile of unfinished dishes. "We're doing our best, Tim," the cook said, his tone weary. "Your best isn't good enough." Tim snapped, snatching a plate and stomping toward the dining area. Shaq watched as the tension bled into the restaurant floor. A family at a nearby table was quietly discussing leaving without paying, their food cold and their patient's dinner. Another server accidentally spilled a drink, earning a sharp reprimand from Tim, whose temper was nearing its breaking point. "Unbelievable," Tim muttered under his breath as he passed Shaq's table. The words meant more for himself than anyone else. Shaq leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, taking in the scene. It was clear Tim wasn't the only one struggling. The entire staff looked overwhelmed, their movements rushed and uncoordinated. Plates piled up in the kitchen, customers waved for attention, and the atmosphere felt like a ticking time bomb. A loud crash echoed from the kitchen, a tray of glasses had toppled. Tim rushed back, his frustration boiling over. "What's going on back here? Can't anyone do their job properly?" The cooks and servers exchanged nervous glances, avoiding eye contact. One brave dishwasher mumbled, "We're short-staffed, Tim. Maybe if you'd help instead of yelling." Tim's face reddened. "Help? I'm the only one keeping this place from falling apart." Shaq decided to intervene. He stood and walked toward the kitchen, his towering presence commanding immediate attention. The staff fell silent as he stepped in, his calm demeanor cutting through the chaos. "Need a hand?" Shaq asked, his voice steady but firm. Tim turned, startled. "What are you doing back here? Customers aren't allowed." "Relax," Shaq said, picking up a towel. "Looks like you could use some extra help." Tim stared at him, unsure how to respond. The cooks exchanged curious glances, recognizing Shaq but unsure if it was really him. Shaq grabbed a plate and began arranging food with practiced ease. "You know how to do this?" one of the cooks asked, astonished. "Been around a few kitchens," Shaq replied with a small smile. Tim folded his arms, skeptical. "All right, fine. If you think you're so good, let's see you handle Table 9's order." Shaq nodded and got to work. In minutes he had the plate ready, garnished perfectly. He handed it to a server, who rushed it to the table. The customer's reaction was immediate, a beaming smile as they took a bite. The staff murmured in amazement, and even Tim looked impressed, though he quickly masked it with a scowl. "Beginner's luck," he muttered. Shaq didn't react, instead focusing on helping where he could. He assisted the cooks with plating, the servers with carrying trays, and even the dishwasher with the growing pile of dirty dishes. His calm, methodical approach began to rub off on the staff. The once chaotic kitchen started to find its rhythm. Tim watched, his frustration slowly giving way to curiosity. "All right, big guy," he said, finally breaking the silence. "What's your deal? You some kind of food critic or something?" Shaq chuckled. "Something like that. Just want to see this place succeed." Tim narrowed his eyes, suspicion creeping in. "Why do you care so much?" Shaq met his gaze, his tone steady. "Because people deserve better. Customers, staff, you all deserve a place that works." For a moment, Tim was speechless. He glanced around, noticing how the atmosphere had shifted. The staff moved with more confidence, their previous frustration giving way to focus. Even the customers seemed happier, their complaints dwindling. "Fine," Tim said, softening slightly. "You've got some moves, I'll give you that. But this place is a mess. One good night won't fix it." Shaq nodded. "You're right. It won't. But every change starts somewhere. Tim sighed, his defenses cracking just a little. Maybe. But it's not like anyone cares enough to really fix it. Shaq didn't reply immediately, instead handing Tim a plate. Take this to table 7. Let's start there. Tim hesitated but took the plate, walking toward the dining area. Shaq watched him go, a small smile playing on his lips. He wasn't here to fix everything in one night, but he'd seen enough to know that change was possible, and Tim, whether he realized it or not, was part of that change. Tim returned to the kitchen, his pace slower, his usual sharpness dulled by thought. Shaq had shaken something loose in him, though he wasn't sure what. The man's calm confidence didn't feel patronizing, it felt steady, like an anchor in the chaos. Tim hated to admit it, but it was hard not to respect that. Still, respect didn't pay the bills, and it sure didn't solve the problems he faced daily. As he leaned against the counter, Tim's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a notification from his landlord, a not-so-friendly reminder about overdue rent. He groaned, rubbing his temples. Between his long hours at the restaurant and the mounting pressure of personal debts, he felt like he was constantly treading water, never catching a break. A voice broke through his thoughts. You good? Tim looked up to see Shaq standing nearby, arms crossed but not in a confrontational way. It was more like curiosity. Concern, maybe? Yeah, Tim lied, pocketing his phone. Just peachy. Shaq didn't push, but his silence was loud enough to nudge Tim into talking. Look, man, you wouldn't get it. This job? It's a grind. And for what? Minimum wage and endless complaints? He gestured toward the dining area, where a customer was waving at another server. Half the people out there treat us like we're invisible, and the other half treat us like punching bags. You tell me how I'm supposed to keep a smile through all that. Shaq nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Sounds rough. But let me ask you something, why stay? Tim blinked, the question catching him off guard. What do you mean? I mean, if it's so bad, why not leave? Find something else? Tim hesitated, the words sticking in his throat. It's not that simple. Jobs don't just grow on trees, you know. And even if they did, who's gonna hire someone like me? I barely finished school, I've got no connections, no family to fall back on. He trailed off, realizing he'd said more than he intended. Shaq stayed quiet for a moment, letting the words hang in the air. Then he said, Sounds like you've been carrying a lot on your own. Tim scoffed. Yeah, well, what else is new? You ever ask for help? The question hit harder than Tim expected. He laughed bitterly. Help? From who? Everyone's got their own problems. Nobody's got time to worry about mine. Shaq leaned against the counter, his sighs making the gesture seem almost comical. Maybe. Or maybe you've been too busy keeping people at arm's length to find out. Tim opened his mouth to argue but stopped. Was that true? He thought back to the way he'd snapped at the staff earlier, the way he pushed through every shift like he was fighting a battle no one else understood. Maybe he had been shutting people out, but it wasn't like anyone had given him a reason to trust them, either. Look, Shaq said, interrupting his thoughts. I'm not saying it's all on you. Life's tough. But the way I see it, you've got two choices: keep letting it grind you down, or start finding ways to push back. Tim stared at him, trying to process the words. And what, you're some kind of motivational speaker now? Shaq grinned. Nah. Just a guy who's been through his own grind. Tim snorted, but there was no malice in it. All right, big guy. So what's your big solution? How do I push back, huh? Shaq straightened up, his grin fading into something more serious. Start with what you can control. You can't fix everything overnight, but you can fix your attitude. People notice that. It changes things, even if it's slow. Tim rolled his eyes but didn't argue. Part of him wanted to dismiss Shaq's advice as naive, but another part, a quieter, smaller part, felt like maybe the big guy was onto something. Fine, Tim said after a pause. I'll try to chill out or whatever. But don't expect miracles. Never do, Shaq replied, his grin returning. Tim shook his head, a reluctant smirk tugging at his lips. For the first time in what felt like ages, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little lighter. Maybe this guy was more than just another clueless customer. Maybe, just maybe, he had a point. The dinner rush had finally subsided, leaving a silence in the restaurant that felt almost unnatural. Tim wiped down a counter, his movements slower now, less frantic than before. He glanced around the room, noticing how the staff seemed more at ease, their faces less tense, their laughter more frequent. Shaq had definitely left an impression, and as much as Tim hated to admit it, he had done something the restaurant needed. He'd shown the staff that they didn't have to carry the weight of everything alone. Not bad tonight, Tim muttered to no one in particular, his voice quiet but reflective. One of the servers, Rachel, looked up from her section with a smile. Yeah, the vibe was way better. You were a lot calmer too. Tim shot her a quick glance, half guilty, half amused. Let's not get too carried away. It's still a mess in here. Rachel shrugged, still smiling. Maybe. But it's a mess we can handle. Tim nodded, feeling a faint stir of something unfamiliar. It was hope. He hated it. It was easier to hold on to anger, easier to bury himself in frustration and blame. But hope? Hope required vulnerability. Hope required change. The door opened, and a customer walked in, a regular who seemed to always have a complaint. Tim braced himself, preparing for the usual confrontation. But as the man approached, something in Tim shifted. He didn't feel the familiar irritation rise in his chest. Instead, he straightened up and greeted the customer with a calm, neutral smile. Evening, Mr. Hart, Tim said, his voice steady. What can I get for you tonight? The man blinked, a little taken aback. Same as always. The steak, medium rare. And a glass of your best red wine. Tim nodded, taking the order without missing a beat. He could feel Rachel's eyes on him, but he didn't care. What mattered now was how he handled things, not how he reacted. Coming right up, Tim said, walking toward the kitchen. He noticed the shift in the energy as he passed through the staff. They weren't just moving through the motions anymore. They were actively engaged. They were working together. As he placed the order with the cooks, he found himself speaking more calmly than usual, giving clear instructions without barking. He had no idea when it had happened, but it seemed like the staff was actually listening to him. They were working as a unit, not just individuals trying to survive the chaos. Back in the dining area, Tim noticed Shaq sitting at the bar, a glass of water in front of him. He hadn't noticed the man enter, but then again, he wasn't sure how he would have reacted. For the first time, he didn't feel that nagging discomfort in his gut. Shaq caught his eye and raised a hand in greeting. Hey, Tim. You're looking a lot more in control tonight. Tim wasn't sure how to respond to that. It felt like praise, but not in a way that made him uncomfortable. It wasn't about being better than anyone else. It was about being better for himself. Yeah, well, I'm trying to take your advice, Tim said, walking over to the bar and leaning against it. It's not easy, but it's starting to feel worth it. Shaq smiled, a genuine, warm smile. Good. You've got what it takes to run this place. But it's not just about you. It's about everyone here. The team. Tim nodded, feeling the weight of those words. I've been running on my own for so long, I forgot what it was like to have people you can rely on. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. That's where it all starts. You've got to lean on your people. That's leadership. Not just giving orders, but showing up for your team when they need it most. Tim thought about that, letting it sink in. Leadership wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room or the one who called all the shots. It was about building something stronger than just a group of individuals. It was about trust, about collaboration, about knowing that everyone was in it together. Yeah, I get it, Tim said quietly. But what about you? You don't have to be here, you know. You've got the money, the connections. What's your angle? Shaq chuckled softly. I'm here because I care. I care about people, about businesses, about creating something that lasts. And if I can help a place like this make it better, then that's what I'm gonna do. Tim couldn't help but stare at him, a mix of admiration and confusion swirling in his mind. Why did Shaq care so much about a random restaurant, about a bunch of people he'd only just met? It didn't make sense, but then again, maybe that was the point. Maybe it wasn't supposed to make sense. Maybe it was just about doing the right thing, no matter how small. The door to the restaurant opened again, and the evening crowd began to trickle in. The buzz of conversation, the clink of glasses, the soft hum of conversation, it was all familiar. But tonight it felt different. It felt like a place where things could improve, a place where change was possible. Tim stood up straight, took a deep breath, and walked back into the fray. It wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like it was worth the effort. The next day, the energy in the restaurant had shifted even more dramatically. It was subtle at first, like the calm before a storm, but as the lunch rush began, Tim noticed that his interactions with the staff were different. People greeted him with a more genuine smile, their conversations with one another were less strained, and even the once tense atmosphere seemed to have a different tone. Tim stood at the back of the room, watching the chaos unfold, but this time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt manageable. He was still the same guy, but somehow, he was handling it better. His focus was sharper, his mind clearer. He had embraced the change, and it wasn't just in how he approached the job, it was in how he saw his role in it. "Tim, can you help me with this table?" Rachel called from across the room. Tim glanced over and gave her a nod, moving toward the table without hesitation. There was a fluidity in his steps now, like he belonged. It wasn't just the way he moved, but the way the staff moved around him. Everyone had begun to anticipate each other's needs. He arrived at the table and greeted the couple sitting there. "What can I get for you folks today?" The woman smiled brightly. "We'll start with the calamari, and I'll have the salmon medium." Tim jotted down the order, his pen moving with a calm, practiced ease. "Got it. And for you, sir?" The man, slightly more subdued, glanced at the menu before ordering his meal. "I'll have the ribeye medium rare. And a glass of your best red wine, please." Tim nodded and walked away, but not without noticing the small shift in the couple's demeanor. There was no hint of impatience, no undercurrent of annoyance. They were relaxed. For the first time, the customers were as calm as the staff. In the kitchen, Tim relayed the orders with the same calm, measured tone. He hadn't even realized how much it had changed until he saw the cooks responding with more focus. They didn't seem rushed. They didn't seem irritated. They were simply working. The rhythm was different now. Shaq's words echoed in his mind. Leadership wasn't just about telling people what to do. It was about setting the example, showing them that it was possible to stay composed under pressure. He hadn't realized how much of an impact his own attitude could have on the entire restaurant, but now it was clear. By the time the orders were ready, Tim found himself at the pass, handing off plates with a sense of pride that hadn't been there before. It wasn't about impressing anyone, it was about doing his job with integrity, giving the team the chance to shine. As he moved between tables, the sense of unity among the staff became more palpable. He saw Rachel helping another server, offering advice when she noticed a mistake. He saw Derek, who had always been the most cynical of the group, working with a focus that bordered on determination. There was no tension between them, no snide remarks or complaints. It was teamwork, pure and simple. And yet there was still something missing. Tim knew it deep down. The restaurant had changed, but the real test had yet to come. He couldn't ignore the fact that it wasn't just about the staff or the customers anymore. It was about the business itself, the ownership, the leadership. It was about Shaq and what he would do next. When the last plate was served and the restaurant began to slow down, Tim found Shaq sitting at the bar again, sipping water and watching the hustle with an attentive eye. "You've done good today," Shaq said, not looking up but knowing that Tim was nearby. Tim leaned against the bar, wiping his hands on his apron. "Yeah, I guess things have been running smoother." Shaq nodded slowly. "But you know, It's not just about running the place well. It's about creating a culture here. It's about making people feel like they belong, like they're part of something bigger than just a paycheck. Tim raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And how do you do that? Shaq looked over at him, his eyes serious. You've got to show people they matter. You've got to build trust. Once people trust you, they'll follow you. It's not just about giving orders, it's about inspiring people to want to do their best. Tim processed the words, the weight of them settling in his mind. Trust. Inspiration. These weren't things that could be demanded or forced, they had to be earned. Right. And you think I'm doing that? Tim asked, unsure if he was ready for the answer. Shaq studied him for a moment before replying. You're getting there. But it's a journey. Don't think it's something that happens overnight. Tim nodded, knowing the truth in Shaq's words. This wasn't a quick fix. This was a long-term process, something that required patience and consistency. As the evenings shifted into the later hours, the last few customers trickled out, and the staff began cleaning up. The restaurant, once filled with tension, now had a different kind of energy, one that was lighter, freer. The team wasn't just a group of individuals doing their jobs. They were a unit, a collective, a community working toward the same goal. Tim looked around, feeling a strange sense of pride swelling in his chest. It wasn't about being the best. It was about doing better, together. The next day, as the evening began to settle in and the staff prepared for another busy shift, there was a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. The restaurant buzzed with energy, but this time, it was a different kind of buzz. It wasn't the frantic, panicked chaos of the past. It was a more measured, focused energy. It was as if everyone had agreed, without saying a word, to step up their game. Tim stood at the front, overseeing the floor as he checked on the staff, making sure everyone was in sync. He saw Rachel moving smoothly between tables, Derek assisting the new guy with a quick explanation, and even the cooks seemed to be in a better rhythm. There was a confidence in the air, one that hadn't been there before. It was tangible. Shaq walked in, his usual calm presence immediately noticeable as he made his way to the back. Tim caught his eye, nodding in acknowledgement. Shaq's words from the previous days still resonated in his mind, and he knew that the shift in the restaurant wasn't just about the work. It was about the people, the team. Tim had learned the hard way that success didn't come from isolating yourself or trying to be the hero. It came from building a culture, one where everyone felt valued and supported. Tim, looking good in here, Shaq said, giving him a quick smile as he walked past. Tim smiled back, but it was different now. There was no tension, no sense of proving himself. He had nothing to prove. Thanks. I think we're finally getting into a rhythm. Shaq nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. That's what I like to see. But remember, this isn't just about tonight. It's about what comes next. The real work starts after the rush, when it's time to build on what you've started. Tim absorbed the words quietly. He knew they were true. The progress the team had made over the last few days wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. If they were going to keep moving forward, they had to keep pushing, keep improving. They couldn't afford to get complacent. The dinner rush began, and the energy in the restaurant picked up again. But now, instead of feeling like a wave threatening to drown him, Tim felt like he was riding the current. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but there was something different this time. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. Table 5's asking for a refill. Rachel called from across the room. I'll get it. Tim nodded, already stepping toward the kitchen to check on orders. The kitchen, for once, was quiet, not in the usual tense silence, but in a way that felt like focus. The staff moved with purpose, and everything seemed to flow more smoothly. Tim had learned that it wasn't just about shouting orders. It was about being clear, being concise, and most importantly, being calm. Shaq reappeared from the back, this time with a few of the regulars in tow. He waved over at Tim, who nodded back in acknowledgement. The regulars seemed happy to see Shaq, and Tim couldn't help but notice how the atmosphere shifted when Shaq was around. It wasn't just his presence, it was his attitude. He had a way of making everyone feel like they mattered, like they were part of something bigger. It was something Tim had never quite grasped before, but now he was beginning to understand. As the evening wore on, the restaurant continued to run smoothly. Tim walked through the dining area, checking on tables, offering refills, and making sure everything was up to standard. There was a lightness in his step now, a quiet confidence that came from knowing the team had his back. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all of them. By the time the last customer left, Tim felt exhausted but content. The night had gone better than he could have hoped, and as the staff began to clean up, there was no sign of the usual tension or resentment that used to linger in the air. Everyone was focused on the task at hand, working together without the usual bickering or complaints. There was something different in the way they moved, in the way they communicated. They were no longer just colleagues. They were a team. Tim leaned against the bar, watching the team work. Shaq appeared next to him, looking out at the staff with a proud smile. "You've got something here, Tim," Shaq said quietly. "This place has potential. But it's up to you to keep it going." Tim nodded, the weight of those words settling in. This was just the beginning. They had come a long way, but there was still work to be done. He couldn't afford to get complacent now, not when they had made so much progress. "Yeah, I get that," Tim said, his voice steady. "I won't let it slip." Shaq gave him a firm look. "Good. Keep pushing. The moment you stop pushing, that's when things start to fall apart." Tim watched him walk away, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be days when it felt like the world was working against him. But he also knew that with his team by his side, they could handle anything that came their way. The real challenge was in how they responded to the hard days. It wasn't about avoiding problems, it was about handling them when they came up. As the staff finished cleaning and started to head out for the night, Tim stood by the door, watching them leave. The energy in the restaurant had shifted, and so had he. The past few days had taught him something valuable, that leadership wasn't just about being in charge. It was about building something lasting, something real. And that was what he was going to do, for himself and for his team. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. What mattered now was the journey ahead. The following week, Tim could feel the change in the air. There was a quiet buzz in the restaurant, but it wasn't the chaotic energy of days past. It was a new kind of energy, focused, productive, and driven. The staff moved with a sense of purpose, their interactions more cordial, their teamwork stronger. Even Derek, who had once seemed like a loose cannon, was showing a newfound discipline in his actions. It was as if everyone had decided, almost overnight, to buy into the idea of working together toward a common goal. The turnaround wasn't immediate, and it certainly wasn't easy. There were still moments of tension, but they were different now, manageable, even productive. Tim was learning to read the room, to sense when someone was overwhelmed and when someone needed a little push. He was becoming more of a leader than he had ever thought he could be. Shaq had continued his low-key presence in the restaurant, popping in now and then, always observing but rarely intervening. His absence of direct involvement was almost more impactful than if he had been standing over them, micromanaging. He had made it clear that he trusted Tim and the team to handle the day-to-day, but that didn't mean he was disengaged. Tim appreciated the way Shaq led by example, trusting people to figure things out for themselves, but offering his wisdom when it was needed most. Tim had started to find his footing, but there was still a sense of urgency in the way he approached his job. The restaurant was still a work in progress, and he was determined to make sure it wasn't just a fleeting improvement. He wanted the change to be lasting, and for that, he knew he couldn't let up. Leadership wasn't just about managing people, it was about inspiring them, about showing them that they mattered and that they could do better. The first real test of this new approach came when the health inspector showed up unannounced. The restaurant had been running smoothly, but the pressure of an unexpected inspection rattled even the most seasoned staff members. Tim felt his stomach tighten as he greeted the inspector, his mind racing. It wasn't just about making sure everything was up to code. It was about proving that they had turned the corner, that they had truly changed. Tim didn't panic, though. He could feel the difference in the staff, the way they held themselves, the way they carried the weight of responsibility with pride instead of resentment. As the inspector moved through the restaurant, Tim kept his eye on the staff, watching for any signs of nervousness or hesitation. But to his surprise, no one faltered. Everyone seemed to know their role, and more importantly, they seemed to care about doing it well. The inspector asked questions, made observations, and Tim responded confidently, relying on the systems they had put in place over the last few weeks. There were still minor issues, but nothing major, nothing that couldn't be easily addressed. Tim could sense the inspector's approval, and it wasn't just about the food or the cleanliness. It was about the way the restaurant felt. It felt professional. It felt like it was heading in the right direction. When the inspector finally left, Tim exhaled the breath he didn't realize he had been holding. He looked around at his team, and for the first time, he saw them not just as colleagues, but as partners. They had pulled together, and in doing so, they had proved to themselves that they were capable of more than just surviving, they were capable of thriving. Shaq appeared at the back of the restaurant, his usual calm demeanor in place. He had witnessed everything from the sidelines, and Tim could see the slight smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Well, that went well," Tim said, wiping his brow. "I think we passed with flying colors." Shaq nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "You did more than pass, Tim. You showed that this place is different now. You've built something real. Keep it up." Tim smiled, feeling a sense of pride that he hadn't experienced before. The compliment meant more than anything else because he knew it wasn't just about passing an inspection. It was about proving to himself, to his team, and to Shaq that they had what it took to succeed. Later that night, as the last customer left and the staff began to wind down, Tim reflected on the past few weeks. They had come a long way. There had been bumps along the road, moments of doubt, but they had managed to keep moving forward. And now, with the inspector's visit behind them and a stronger team than ever, Tim felt a renewed sense of purpose. But he knew the journey wasn't over. They had achieved something, but that didn't mean they could rest on their laurels. The real challenge was maintaining this momentum, continuing to push for growth and improvement, and keeping the culture they had built intact. As the staff filtered out for the night, Tim lingered for a moment, looking around at the empty restaurant. There was a sense of peace in the space now, a sense of accomplishment. He knew they were only scratching the surface, but that was okay. They had built a foundation. And now, it was up to him to make sure they didn't let it slip away. He walked to the back, where Shaq was finishing his own round of checking in. "Thanks for everything," Tim said, his voice steady but filled with gratitude. Shaq looked up, giving him a nod of approval. "You did the hard work, Tim. I'm just here to watch it unfold. You're the one who's leading this team now." Tim didn't have any more words to add. He simply nodded in return, knowing that the journey was far from over, but he was more ready for it than ever before. Tim sat at his desk, hands clasped in front of him, reflecting on the changes that had unfolded in the last few months. The restaurant had transformed into something he hadn't believed possible when he first started. The sense of chaos had given way to a well-oiled machine, and the team had become more than just employees. They were a family, united by their shared experiences and the vision they were now working toward. It was remarkable how far they had come. Yet, the pressure wasn't over. If anything, it had intensified. The success of the last few months was now expected. The bar had been raised, and Tim could feel the weight of it. He had grown into his role as a leader, but every day came with its own set of challenges. It wasn't just about maintaining the status quo, it was about finding ways to continue evolving, to continue growing, both as a team and as individuals. Shaq had been more distant lately, not in a negative way, but as though he were stepping back to let Tim truly take the reins. His occasional visits had turned into more sporadic check-ins, but when he did appear, his presence was a quiet reminder of the trust he had placed in Tim. There was no micromanaging, no interference, just subtle encouragement and the occasional word of wisdom when it was needed. But even with Shaq's support, Tim couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he could do. He wasn't content to simply maintain the restaurant's success. He wanted it to be a place of growth, a place where everyone felt valued and inspired to give their best every day. The diversity of the team was one of their greatest strengths, and Tim knew that fostering an environment where everyone felt they could contribute and lead in their own way was key to their continued success. One afternoon, as the lunch rush slowed and the staff took a well-earned break, Tim decided it was time for a change. He gathered everyone together in the staff room. There was a quiet murmur as the staff settled in, unsure of what the meeting would entail. Tim stood at the front, looking at the faces of the people who had become not just his co-workers but his partners in this journey. He could feel the weight of the moment. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Tim began, his voice steady but with an edge of determination, "about where we've been and where we're going. And honestly, we've done something incredible here. We've turned this place around. But that's not enough. We can't stop here. We have to keep pushing forward, keep finding ways to improve, to grow. And that starts with each and every one of you." There was a slight tension in the room, a nervous energy as the staff tried to read between the lines. Tim could sense their uncertainty, but he pushed forward. "I want us to start thinking differently. I want us to look at leadership not as something that's only for those in charge but as something that each of us can embrace. I want us to support each other, mentor each other, and challenge each other to be the best versions of ourselves. We're all leaders here, in one way or another. And we can't keep going if we don't have each other's backs." The room was silent, the staff processing his words. Tim knew that not everyone would immediately buy into the idea. It was a big shift, and it wasn't easy to change the way people thought. But he had seen firsthand what they were capable of, and he believed in their potential. He had to believe that they could rise to this challenge, too. "Look," Tim continued, "I know it's easy to get comfortable. But comfort doesn't lead to greatness. We need to embrace the discomfort, the uncertainty, because that's where the real growth happens. So let's start holding each other accountable. Let's make sure that we're always pushing ourselves and each other to be better." A few faces softened, nodding in agreement. Others remained skeptical, unsure of what this shift would mean for them. Tim wasn't naive enough to think that it would be an easy transition, but he was committed to seeing it through. He wasn't just talking about business strategies. He was talking about building something deeper. He wanted to create a culture of inclusion and empathy, where everyone felt their voices were heard, where mistakes were opportunities for growth, not shame. As the meeting wrapped up, Tim could sense the mixed emotions in the room. There were a few who were on board, eager to embrace the challenge. Others were more reserved, waiting to see how it would all play out. But there was a sense of collective purpose in the air that hadn't been there before. In the weeks that followed, the shift was gradual. Tim continued to emphasize personal responsibility and leadership, encouraging the staff to take ownership of their roles in a way that went beyond their specific duties. Slowly but surely, people began to step up. There was a noticeable increase in communication, in collaboration, and in the sense of camaraderie. It wasn't perfect. There were still growing pains, moments of tension, but the progress was undeniable. One evening, after a particularly successful dinner service, Tim walked through the restaurant, observing the team. The hustle was palpable, but so was the respect. People weren't just doing their jobs. They were working together, looking out for one another, and taking pride in their work. It wasn't about the paycheck anymore. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. And Tim realized, as he stood there in that moment, that they had truly built something special. As the staff began to trickle out at the end of the night, Shaq appeared, as he often did, to check in on things. Tim was wiping down the counter, but he paused when he saw Shaq. There was no need for words, no need for validation. Shaq simply gave him a nod of approval, and in that small gesture, Tim knew everything was heading in the right direction. They had built something sustainable, something that could weather any storm, and it was a legacy they could all be proud of. It was no longer just about running a successful restaurant. It was about creating a space where people could grow, where leadership wasn't just a title but a responsibility, and where everyone, no matter their background, their position, or their story, could find their place and thrive. Tim had learned that the real key to success wasn't in the numbers or the accolades. It was in the people. And as long as they continued to invest in each other, they would continue to succeed, together.